The first alarm that blared through the Interspecies Academy wasn't the standard wake-up call. It was the predator warning, high-pitched, pulsating, and unmistakable. Rick Young bolted upright in his dormitory bed, momentarily forgetting he was the only human enrolled in the prestigious Galactic Education Initiative. The alarm meant one thing: something dangerous had breached the campus perimeter. "Not again," he muttered, throwing off his covers and reaching for the emergency protocol tablet beside his bed. The red text scrolled across the screen. "Level 3 Predator Alert. All students remain in designated safe areas. This is not a drill." Rick pulled on his uniform, the same blue and silver ensemble worn by every student, though his was specially tailored for human physiology. The academy housed over 2,000 students from across the galaxy, but he remained the only representative of Earth since the program began accepting humans 5 years ago. A frantic knocking rattled his door. "Rick, are you awake? We need to get to the shelter." The voice belonged to Zorix, his Arcturian roommate from the adjacent dorm. Rick opened the door to find Zorix's 4 eyes wide with panic, all of them blinking rapidly, a clear sign of extreme stress in his species. The Arcturian's pale blue skin had taken on a grayish tint. "What kind of predator is it this time?" Rick asked, grabbing his emergency kit from beside the door. "They're saying it's a Crenthian stalker," Zorix whispered, his voice trembling. "One of the security drones spotted it near the biochemistry complex." Rick's stomach tightened. Crenthian stalkers were among the most feared predators in the northern quadrant, 6-limbed hunters with razor-sharp sensory capabilities and a venomous bite that could paralyze most sentient species within seconds. "We should move," Rick said. "The nearest shelter's in the linguistics building, right?" Zorix nodded, his head crest flattening in fear. "The professor said all morning classes are canceled until they capture or neutralize it." As they stepped into the hallway, Rick immediately noticed the chaos. Students of various species hurried in all directions, some moving with calm purpose while others displayed obvious panic. A group of Malorian students, recognizable by their crystalline exoskeletons, huddled together, their bodies emitting a faint distress glow. "This way," Rick said, guiding Zorix toward the emergency exit. "Stay close." They pushed through the crowded corridor, passing a group of first-year Vanthi students whose tentacle-like appendages were writhing in obvious distress. Rick had learned in his xenobiology class that Vanthi experienced fear physically, their bodies releasing stress hormones that caused involuntary movement. Outside, the academy grounds were bathed in the purple light of dawn. The 3 moons of Nexus Prime were still visible in the sky, pale against the brightening atmosphere. Under different circumstances, Rick might have stopped to appreciate the view. It still amazed him that he was studying light years from Earth, but now his focus was on reaching safety. "There!" Zorix pointed with one of his upper limbs toward the linguistics building, its domed roof gleaming in the early light. They were halfway across the central quad when the snarl came, a sound so primal and terrifying that it stopped every student in their tracks. It echoed across the campus, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Around them, the reaction was immediate and universal. The Vanthi students collapsed into tight balls, their natural defense mechanism. A tall Quarian student's plumage stood on end, tripling his apparent size. Even the normally stoic Draxians froze, their compound eyes swiveling frantically to locate the threat. Rick, however, found himself scratching his head. The sound, while certainly loud, didn't trigger the same instinctive terror in him. In fact, it sounded oddly familiar. "We need to run," Zorix hissed, tugging at Rick's sleeve with such force that it nearly tore. "Wait," Rick said, holding up a hand. "Something's not right." "What do you mean, not right?" Zorix's voice rose an octave. "That's a Crenthian stalker. They've killed entire survey teams." "I know what they say about stalkers, but—" Rick paused as the snarl echoed again. This time, he concentrated on the sound. It had a pattern to it, a rhythm that seemed almost artificial. "Everyone, stay calm." A voice boomed over the campus-wide communication system. It belonged to Professor Nylax, head of xenobiology. Security teams are converging on the predator's location. Please proceed to designated shelters immediately. Rick turned to Zorix. I want to check something out. Are you insane? Zorix's voice was a mixture of disbelief and terror. You'll be killed. I don't think so, Rick replied. That sound, I've heard something like it before. On Earth. Before Zorix could protest further, Rick was moving not toward the shelter, but in the direction of the biochemistry complex where the predator had been spotted. Rick! Zorix called after him, but fear kept the Arcturian rooted in place. Rick moved swiftly across the campus, aware that he was probably breaking every safety protocol in the Academy handbook. The grounds were emptying quickly as students and faculty rushed to the shelters. Within minutes, he found himself alone, approaching the sleek curved structure of the biochemistry building. The snarl came again, louder now that he was closer to its source. Rick stopped and listened carefully. Yes, there was definitely something off about it, a mechanical quality that wouldn't be present in a biological sound. He rounded the corner of the building and froze. There, in the small garden area designed for botanical experiments, was a creature that matched the description of a Crenthian stalker. 6 limbs, iridescent scales that shifted colors with movement, and a long, sinuous body. It was moving among the alien plants, making that terrifying sound at irregular intervals. But Rick noticed something else, a small, blinking device attached to the creature's neck. Cautiously, he moved closer. The stalker turned in his direction, its facial plates shifting to reveal rows of sensory nodes rather than the expected teeth. It made the snarling sound again, but Rick saw now that it came from the device, not the creature itself. You're not a predator at all, are you? He whispered. The stalker tilted its head, almost like a confused dog. One of its front limbs pawed at the device on its neck, clearly irritated by it. Rick took a calculated risk. He grabbed a fallen branch from one of the exotic trees and slowly extended it toward the stalker. The creature sniffed at it, then gently took it in its mouth not to bite, but to play. It dropped the stick and looked at Rick expectantly. You're someone's pet, Rick realized aloud, or a research specimen. At that moment, the snarl blasted again, but this time Rick saw it clearly. The device activated independently of the creature's behavior. Rick made a decision. He moved closer, speaking in a low, soothing voice. Hey there, it's okay. Let me help you with that thing. The stalker remained still, watching him with intelligent eyes that showed no sign of aggression. When Rick was within arm's reach, he slowly extended his hand. The creature sniffed it, then pressed its head against his palm. With careful movements, Rick examined the device on its neck. It was sophisticated technology, a small box with what appeared to be a speaker and some kind of timer. There was also a tracking component and a clasp that kept it secured to the stalker. Let's get this off you, he murmured, finding the release mechanism and carefully disengaging it. The device came free, and immediately the stalker shook itself, as if relieved of a great burden. The device continued to emit the snarl, now in Rick's hand. He studied it briefly, then pressed what he guessed was the power button. The sound died instantly. What are you doing? A shocked voice called out. Rick turned to see Professor Alara, the head of xenotechnology, staring at him in horror from the edge of the garden. Behind her stood 2 security officers in protective gear, their stun weapons trained on the stalker. Don't shoot, Rick called out, stepping between the weapons and the creature. It's not dangerous. Someone put this on it. He held up the device. It's been making the predator sounds, not the animal. Professor Alara approached cautiously, her 6-fingered hands outstretched. Give me that, Mr. Young. Rick handed over the device, and the professor examined it with growing confusion. This is a standard research tracker, she said slowly, but it's been modified. The vocalization feature isn't supposed to mimic predator calls. The security officers lowered their weapons slightly, but remained tense. The creature isn't aggressive, Rick explained. I think it's domesticated, or at least trained. Look. He picked up the stick again and tossed it gently. The stalker bounded after it, returned it to Rick, and sat back expectantly, its tail sweeping the ground. Professor Lara's expression shifted from fear to scientific curiosity. Remarkable. Crenthian stalkers are apex predators. They're not known to be tameable. Maybe it's not a pure stalker, Rick suggested, or maybe what we think we know about them is wrong. The professor was about to respond when her communication device buzzed. She answered it, listened briefly, then looked up with a grave expression. Security has just detained a second-year student from the xenobiology department, she said. Apparently, this is his research specimen, a genetically modified stalker with predatory instincts removed. He claims he was conducting an unauthorized experiment on fear responses among different species. So he deliberately caused a panic, one of the security officers asked. It appears so, Professor Lara replied. Dean Thrax wants everyone in the main auditorium in 1 hour. This incident will need to be addressed. An hour later, the entire student body and faculty were gathered in the vast auditorium. The modified stalker had been secured in the veterinary facility, where preliminary scans confirmed it was indeed a genetic hybrid, created to have the appearance of a predator but the temperament of a domesticated animal. Dean Thrax, an imposing figure with 4 arms and a dignified crest of sensory spines, stood at the podium. Beside him was a sullen-looking Brockian student named Morven, presumably the perpetrator of the hoax. Today's incident was not just a breach of Academy rules, Dean Thrax began, his deep voice carrying throughout the hall. It was a deliberate attempt to manipulate the natural fear responses of your fellow students for the sake of data collection. A murmur ran through the crowd. Rick sat between Zorix and Leary, a Solarian student whose bioluminescent skin still pulsed with residual stress. Before I address the disciplinary action that will be taken, the dean continued, I want to recognize the student whose actions prevented this situation from escalating further. Rick Young, would you please join me? Rick felt a moment of surprise, then embarrassment, as thousands of eyes turned toward him. He made his way to the stage, aware of the mixed reactions, respect from some, confusion from others. Once Rick stood beside him, Dean Thrax turned to address the assembly again. Mr. Young disregarded his own safety to investigate an anomaly that others fled from. While I cannot officially condone breaking emergency protocols, his actions today revealed an important truth. Fear responses vary greatly across species, and understanding these differences can sometimes lead to better outcomes. The dean turned to Rick. Would you explain what made you suspect the stalker wasn't a genuine threat? Rick cleared his throat, suddenly aware of the Academy's entire population focused on him. The snarl didn't sound right. It was too regular. Natural predator vocalizations have subtle variations. This one repeated exactly the same way each time, which suggested it was recorded or synthesized. And you didn't feel the fear that your classmates experienced? I felt concern, obviously, Rick explained. But humans don't have the same instinctive fear response to these specific sounds. On Earth, we have predators too, but they make different sounds. Our instincts are tuned to different threats. Dean Thrax nodded thoughtfully. This brings us to the larger lesson from today's events. The Galactic Education Initiative was founded on the principle that diversity strengthens us all. Each species brings unique perspectives and abilities. Today, we saw how a human's different fear response allowed for a solution that might have taken security teams hours to discover. The dean then turned to Morven, the Brockian student. As for you, your research question was not without merit, but your methods were unethical and dangerous. You will face disciplinary action, including academic probation and mandatory ethics training. Additionally, you will prepare a formal apology to the entire Academy community. Morven's head frills drooped in shame as he was escorted from the stage. After the assembly, Rick found himself surrounded by curious students from various species, all eager to understand how he had remained calm during the incident. But weren't you scared at all? Asked Nev, a first-year Quarian whose plumage had finally settled back to its normal position. I was cautious, Rick explained, but the sound itself didn't trigger a panic response in me. Humans evolved alongside different predators than most of you did. Fascinating, said Professor Krell, who had joined the group. As the Academy's expert on comparative psychology, he seemed particularly intrigued. This could form the basis for an excellent research project, Mr. Young one conducted with proper ethical approvals, of course. The crowd eventually dispersed, leaving Rick with Zorix, who had remained uncharacteristically quiet. I thought you were committing suicide, Zorix finally said as they walked back toward their dormitory. When you ran toward the stalker instead of away from it, I was certain I'd never see you alive again, Rick smiled. I'm sorry I scared you. I should have explained my thinking better. No, I'm glad you didn't, Zorix replied, surprising Rick. I've been at this academy for 3 years, and I've never questioned my own fear responses. Today made me realize how much I still have to learn about other species, including humans. That evening, Rick received a message requesting his presence in Professor Nylax's laboratory the following morning. Curious, he arrived to find not only the xenobiology professor, but also Dean Thrax and Professor Alara. Mr. Young, Professor Nylax greeted him, gesturing toward a secure observation room. We'd like your input on something. Inside the room, behind a transparent barrier, was the modified stalker from yesterday's incident. It was moving calmly around a habitat designed to mimic its natural environment, occasionally playing with enrichment toys that had been provided. We've been discussing what to do with this creature, Dean Thrax explained. It cannot be released into the wild, as it lacks the necessary survival instincts. Yet it seems cruel to euthanize a healthy animal that poses no inherent threat. What do you think? Professor Alara asked. You seemed to establish a connection with it yesterday. Rick observed the stalker for a moment. Has it been given a name? The professors exchanged glances. The student who created it called it Subject 12, Professor Nylax replied. That's not a name, Rick said. If it's going to live here, it deserves a proper name. Maybe, Rexus? The stalker perked up at the sound of Rick's voice, moving closer to the barrier and placing a paw against it. It seems to remember you, Professor Alara noted with interest. Rexus could serve a valuable purpose here, Rick suggested. It could help with teaching students about genetic modification, ethical research practices, or even interspecies fear responses the right way, with informed consent. Dean Thrax considered this. That might be possible, but it would need a caretaker who understands its needs and behaviors. The 3 academics looked at Rick expectantly. Me? Rick asked, surprised. I don't know anything about caring for a modified stalker. But you understood something fundamental about it that even our experienced security team missed, Professor Nylax pointed out. Sometimes instinct is more valuable than book knowledge. Besides, we would provide all the necessary training and support. Rick looked at the creature at Rexus, who was now watching him with obvious interest. I'd be willing to try if you think it's the best option. Dean Thrax nodded approvingly. Excellent. Professor Nylax will work with you to develop a care regimen and educational program. This could become a unique learning opportunity for the entire academy. In the weeks that followed, Rick divided his time between his regular studies and his new role as caretaker for Rexus. The modified stalker proved to be intelligent and affectionate, quickly learning commands and routines. With proper clearances, Rick began bringing Rexus to selected classes as a living example of both genetic engineering and the importance of understanding fear responses across species. During one such session in Professor Krell's comparative psychology class, Rick was demonstrating how Rexus responded to different stimuli when a student raised a question that would change the direction of his academic career. If humans don't fear the sounds that terrify most of us, asked Talia, a Meridian junior with a specialization in neuropsychology, what sounds do humans instinctively fear? Rick paused, considering the question. That's interesting. There are some sounds that most humans find disturbing, the screams of human infants, for example, or certain frequencies that resemble human distress calls. Our brains are wired to respond to those. Professor Krell leaned forward, intrigued. Could you identify these sounds? Perhaps we could develop a comparative study of fear responses across different species, including humans. I could try, Rick said, though it might be difficult to explain exactly why certain sounds affect us without demonstrations. Would you be willing to subject yourself to a controlled experiment? The professor asked. With proper safety protocols, of course. Rick thought about it. If it would help advance interspecies understanding, yes, but I'd want to help design the protocols to ensure they're both effective and ethical. This conversation led to the formation of a research team dedicated to studying comparative fear responses. Rick became a central figure in the project, working alongside professors and fellow students to develop a comprehensive database of species-specific triggers and reactions. 3 months later, the Academy hosted its annual scientific symposium, where research teams presented their findings to academics from across the galaxy. The Fear Response Project, now formally titled Neurological Variants in Threat Detection Across Sentient Species, was selected as a featured presentation. Rick stood on the same stage where Dean Thrax had addressed the Academy after the stalker incident, but this time he was there as a researcher rather than a student caught breaking protocols. Beside him were Professor Krell, Zorix, Talia, and several other team members from different species. Rexus sat calmly at Rick's feet, now an official therapy animal and research assistant. Our initial hypothesis, Rick began, addressing the packed auditorium, was that fear responses are primarily evolutionary adaptations to specific environmental threats. What we discovered, however, is that these responses are also shaped by cultural learning and can be modified through conscious effort and exposure. He gestured to a holographic display showing neural scans of various species experiencing different fear stimuli. When we exposed test subjects to the recorded snarl of a Crenthian stalker, we observed immediate stress responses in most non-human species, increased heart rates, pupil dilation, and activation of primitive brain regions associated with the fight-or-flight response. Professor Krell stepped forward. However, when we exposed subjects to sounds that humans find instinctively disturbing, such as this, he played a recording of fingernails scraping across a chalkboard, causing Rick to wince while the alien students looked merely curious. We observed little to no stress response in non-human species. Our conclusion, Talia added, is that fear is both universal and highly specialized. All sentient beings experience fear, but what triggers that fear varies dramatically based on evolutionary history and cultural context. After the presentation, which received enthusiastic response from the scientific community, Rick found himself approached by a distinguished-looking human woman he didn't recognize. "That was quite impressive, Mr. Young," she said, extending her hand. "Ambassador Helena Zhang, Earth Diplomatic Corps." Rick shook her hand, surprised. "Thank you, Ambassador. I didn't realize Earth had sent a representative to the symposium." "We hadn't planned to," she admitted, "but when I heard about your research, I made arrangements to attend. The Galactic Council has been discussing the formation of a new department focused on interspecies psychology, particularly as it relates to diplomatic relations. Your work could be foundational for such an initiative." Rick blinked, processing this information. "I'm honored, but I'm still a student. I have 2 more years before I complete my degree." Ambassador Zhang smiled. "Consider this an early recruitment effort. When you graduate, Earth would be proud to recommend you for a position with the Council. Your unique perspective as both a human and someone deeply immersed in alien psychology would be invaluable." The conversation was interrupted by Zorix, who approached with barely contained excitement. "Rick, the Interstellar Science Foundation just offered to fund an expansion of our research." As his friend shared the details, Rick felt a profound sense of how far he had come from that morning when the alarm had blared through the Academy. What had begun with a false predator and a scratched head had evolved into a promising career studying the very thing that made that moment possible. the fundamental differences in how species perceive and respond to the world around them. In the year that followed, the research team expanded their work to include not just fear responses, but the full spectrum of emotional reactions across species. Rick's unique human perspective continued to provide valuable insights, while his relationship with Rexus demonstrated the potential for cross-species bonds that transcended instinctive reactions. The modified stalker became something of a mascot for the Academy, a living symbol of how understanding could overcome fear. Students who once would have fled in terror at the sight of such a creature now volunteered to help with its care and training. On the anniversary of the stalker incident, Dean Thrax hosted a special ceremony to recognize the contributions of the research team. The event was attended not only by Academy members, but also by representatives from the Galactic Council and various scientific institutions. 1 year ago, the Dean said in his opening remarks, we experienced what seemed to be a dangerous incursion by a predator. What it became was a lesson in perspective, a reminder that what terrifies one species may seem harmless to another, and that these differences need not divide us, but can instead enrich our collective understanding. He gestured to Rick and Rexus, who sat side by side on the stage. Mr. Young's instinct to question his own fear response rather than simply react to it led not only to a peaceful resolution, but also to groundbreaking research that has implications for everything from diplomatic relations to psychological treatment methods. After the ceremony, Rick took Rexus for their usual evening walk around the Academy grounds. The 3 moons shone brightly overhead, casting multiple shadows across the paths. Students of various species greeted them, some still maintaining a respectful distance from Rexus, but no longer showing the blind panic of before. "There you are," called a familiar voice. Zorix jogged to catch up with them, carrying a data tablet. "I've been looking everywhere for you." "What's up?" Rick asked, noting his friend's excitement. "I've been analyzing the latest data from our cross-species empathy trials," Zorix explained, bringing up a holographic display. "Look at this pattern." The display showed neural activity from test subjects of different species who had been exposed to recordings of distress signals not from their own species, but from others. "These results suggest something fascinating," Zorix continued. "Even without an evolutionary reason to respond to another species' distress, many subjects showed activation in brain regions associated with empathy. It's as if the capacity for cross-species understanding is hardwired into sentient minds, waiting to be activated by exposure and education." Rick studied the data, impressed by the implications. So our fear responses might be species-specific, but our capacity for empathy could be universal? Exactly. Zorix's 4 eyes all blinked in excitement. This could revolutionize how we approach interspecies relations. If we can teach people to recognize and respond to emotional cues from other species, we might overcome some of our most fundamental barriers to understanding. As they continued walking, discussing the possibilities this discovery opened up, Rick reflected on his journey at the Academy. What had begun as a solitary educational experience, being the only human in a school full of aliens, had become something much more significant. He was no longer just learning about other species. He was helping to forge connections between them. Back in his dormitory that evening, Rick received an unexpected message from Morven, the Brockian student who had caused the original stalker incident. After serving his academic probation and completing his ethics training, Morven had transferred to a different program, but occasionally kept in touch. "I saw the presentation of your research today," the message read. "It's strange to think that my misguided experiment led to something so important. I wanted you to know that I've been accepted into a rehabilitation program for endangered predator species on Bracos 4. I'll be working to protect the very creatures I once exploited. Your work with Rexus showed me that understanding is better than fear, even when it comes to the things that terrify us most." Rick smiled as he composed a reply, wishing Morven well in his new path. The message was a reminder that growth could come from the most unexpected situations, that even a moment of fear could lead to profound understanding if one took the time to scratch their head and ask why. 6 months later, Rick stood in the Academy's transport bay, watching as the latest group of first-year students arrived from worlds across the galaxy. Among them was something unprecedented: 3 more humans, the first to join him at the Academy since he'd arrived. "Nervous?" Zorix asked, standing beside him. "A little," Rick admitted. "I've gotten used to being the only human here." "Well, now you won't have to serve as the sole representative of your species in our research," Zorix joked. "Think of all the comparative data we'll be able to collect." As the new students disembarked, looking around with the same mixture of awe and apprehension that Rick remembered from his first day, he felt a sense of coming full circle. Beside him, Rexus sat calmly, no longer triggering panic despite his predator-like appearance. One of the human newcomers, a young woman named Rachel, approached Rick with obvious relief at seeing a familiar species. "You must be Rick Young," she said. "They told us about you during orientation. Is it true you discovered a new way of understanding alien psychology?" Rick glanced at Zorix, then down at Rexus, then back to the eager new student. "Not exactly," he replied with a smile. "I just learned to question my assumptions, to consider that what seems threatening might not be, and that fear itself can teach us as much as courage." As he showed the new students around campus, introducing them to various species and explaining the unique perspectives each brought to the Academy, Rick felt a deep satisfaction. The false predator alarm had led him not just to a research project or a potential career, but to a fundamental truth about interspecies relations. Understanding begins when we recognize that our own responses to the world are just one possibility among many, when we have the wisdom to pause in the face of apparent danger and simply scratch our heads. By the time graduation came 2 years later, Rick had become something of a legend at the Academy, the human who didn't fear the predator Snarl and changed interspecies psychology as a result. As he prepared to accept Ambassador Zhang's offer to join the Galactic Council's new Department of Interspecies Psychology, with Rexus as his officially recognized companion, he knew that his greatest contribution had not been fearlessness, but curiosity, the willingness to question not just what others feared, but why he didn't share that fear. In his graduation address, speaking to students of more than 100 different species, Rick summed up what he had learned during his time at the Academy. "Fear divides us only when we fail to understand its origins. When we recognize that what terrifies one being may puzzle another, we open the door to a deeper truth that beneath our different exteriors and evolutionary histories, we share a capacity for connection that transcends biology. The next time you encounter something that frightens your classmates but leaves you scratching your head in confusion, don't dismiss their fear or your lack of it. Instead, see it as an opportunity to bridge a gap in understanding that might otherwise remain forever uncrossed." As applause filled the auditorium, Rick looked out at the diverse faces of his fellow graduates and the new students who would follow in their footsteps. The Academy had changed in the years since the stalker incident, not just in its approach to research or its security protocols, but in its fundamental understanding of how different species could learn from each other. And it had all begun with a false predator's snarl and a human who scratched his head instead of running away.